The Canadian National Iron Range was a place like no other, home to many species of rare locomotives. In late spring of 2024, I was made aware that the Canadian National Rare Power on the Iron Range was going to be moved off in favor of new AC-44 C6Ms. Usually I don't take outlandish rail fanning trips. Usually. But this was an exception to the rules. I had to go up to the Iron Range. 15th anniversary Dash 8s? Those are up there. Tunnel motors? Yes. Bessemer? I love the Bessemer. I had to make a trip up at once to film this power before it was gone. So, towards the end of June, I would make my way up towards the Iron Range to shoot this power before it was gone. This was truly the documentation of the end of an era.
There's nothing special about this skull train. I just saw it the day before I left my trip, so I thought it would make a nice background to the intro.
The first rail fanning of the trip would be in Kansas City on my way north. The first train we're going to cover is, well, not really a train, but it's just some stuff I saw at Armourdale Yard, the only notable thing being a yard transfer being led by a GP15. I hadn't seen a GP15 leader in a while, so this is a nice treat. Next I would go to the Kanoki area, where I first went by Mid-America car. Behind the facility, I would stumble across Mid-America Car's Veterans Unit, which I had actually never seen before since it's usually inside the building. This was nice to see, and I'm glad I had my camcorder with me to take this picture. After that, I would head to actual Kanoki and see 2 Grey Ghosts and a Canadian Pacific dual flag AC-44. These were all great to see. The next day I would head away from the beaten path into Marshalltown, Iowa upon the request of a friend to go shoot a local with a Southern Pacific GP60 leading. The first thing I saw was it sitting in the yard. Next I would be jump scared by the IG-4SE with a GEVO duo for power. I would then head to my actual rail fanning spot in Marshalltown, where immediately after opening my Lunchable, I got the ZG2LC with a nice power move on the head end, including a Thundercab Ace leading in the new paint scheme and a flagless GEVO trailing. The next train to pass by will be the Marshalltown Yard Trimmer being led by an SD40N and a GP40N. next train would be the MNS&P, being led by an NS AC44C6M with an awesome raised letter narrow font K5LLA. My next train would be the MDMDM, yarding their consist with a trio of GEs for power. Just 5 minutes after the DMDM backed into the yard, the LNM-34 finally departed Marshalltown, headed for Eddyville as light power with a loaded ethanol with CSX foreign power tailgating it. The ethanol was a nice surprise, as I had no idea it was coming, and it made for an awesome shot of the two trains racing each other. I then continued onward to the Iron Range, passing this Northtown to BRC clearing yard manifest at Dayton's Bluff. Now at Northtown, I began poking around the deadlines to see what I could find. On the other side of the bridge, I was trying to film some footage of the deadline and a warbonnet leading a yard job when this CPKC ethanol train came out of nowhere. If you hadn't already figured it out, I had stopped at Northtown on my way to the Iron Range because I love warbonnets and I wanted to see some in operation. At the time, I had no idea that I would ever be able to see a warbonnet leader ever again. So I stopped here to try to see some. I was able to achieve that task pretty easily, and I got this awesome shot of a warbonnet duo sandwiching an H1 SD40 shoving some cars over the hump. While stopped at McDonald's for some food just outside of Northtown, I checked ATSF monitor for the Iron Range and noticed that a frac sand train with a BCOL -9 had stopped at Shelton Junction to meet a southbound CN train. I decided to head up to the Iron Range and try to catch these two at Virginia. When I got there, the crossing gates went down and the first train came by, being the southbound. I was expecting it to be something like an intermodal with a CN ET44 leading or something and maybe something cool on it, and now that's a terrible way to start off the Iron Range trip. A UP trio on a Coke train, the day that I had actually been on the UP. At least I got this one out of the way. Thankfully, S773 wasn't too far off, so I was able to catch it pretty soon after the southbound cleared. The next morning, I got up bright and early to try to catch a northbound M347 with a Citirail leader and two Illinois Central Death Star SD70s trailing. When I got trackside to Zupet's Drive at Forbes, Minnesota, there was immediately a T-bird in my face when I got there with a 15th anniversary -8 on the point. This was an awesome treat and a great way to start off my first full official day of rail fanning on the Iron Range. Unfortunately, after it passed, I checked the Munger, Minnesota Steel Highway Railcam's Railcam to see if M347 still had the Citirail leader and the Death Stars, and it only had the Citirail leader. I decided to still wait it out anyways, and it's not like I was going to go back to the Airbnb anyways, so I decided to catch this and wait for M347. next train would be M347 with the Citirail leader. Also, it's important to note that Zupet's Drive was the only place in the Iron Range where I could reliably get cell service every time I went there to check Train Mod 5, so that's where I would be for most of the times I was out. After 347 cleared, I saw on ATSF that a southbound ore train was getting onto the Two Harbors sub, so I raced to Ramshaw in hopes of catching it. I was able to make it in time for a C40-8 trio on a southbound loaded ore with an awesome crew on board. Note how this crossing isn't actually a horn zone, so crews aren't obliged to honk here. It was nice of the crew to go out of their way to give me a horn shout. My next catch would actually be a 2-for-1, as I would catch a southbound loaded and northbound empty T-Bird meeting at Forbes. The northbound actually had the 15th anniversary unit leading again, and believe me, this isn't going to be the last time we see it either. My next catch would be a lackluster northbound intermodal. After a bit of a wait, I got my next train, that being a westbound empty ore at Ramshaw. After another much shorter wait, I got my next train, a northbound limestone train bound for Mintac with a Citirail GEVO trailing second. Next up was an empty T-Bird in anything but a hurry. Next up was the loaded T-Bird with 15th anniversary 2112 leading again for the third time that day. Next was S773 from Weyerhaeuser with a C6M on the point. My final train for the day would be a southbound manifest at Ramshaw with a P5 SD70M-2 leading and a shave and a haircut. I thought this would be my last train for the day, but it turns out it wouldn't be, as when I was back in my Airbnb I was watching the Munger rail cam, and all of a sudden a northbound empty ore from Duluth showed up with a Death Star on the point. Obviously I couldn't pass this up as I didn't know if this would be the only Death Star that would pass while I was on the Iron Range, so at 9:30 at night in the mosquitoes I headed trackside and got eaten alive by mosquitoes for this train. I gotta eat some goldfish while I was waiting on it though. The next morning I headed trackside again to Ramshaw in hopes of catching the Keenan-based local heading back to Keenan. Or to Fairlane, I guess, since it went to work Fairlane and then it tied down in the plant, but whatever. When I got there, this southbound ethanol passed on the Rainy sub with a Citirail GEVOs, the rear DPU facing out, and a C6M with a goofy number trailing on the head end. Next was the road switcher crossing the diamond as it began its run towards Fairlane. As I was making my way back to Zupets to get cell service to check train Mon 5, I noticed that the local had stopped at Iron Junction. It turns out it was there to meet a southbound and northbound T-Bird, loaded and empty respectively. The loaded one, of course, had 2112 leading. Once the T-Birds had cleared, the local continued on its way south. It would be a little while before my next train, but it was well worth the wait, as the next train would be an empty ore from Duluth with an awesome trio of power, including a Bessemer tunnel motor trailing third. This is the first Bessemer and Lake Erie locomotive I'd ever seen, and I was so glad I was able to catch it. Unfortunately, it wasn't leading, well, obviously because it was trailing third, but it was still neat to see this unit. Subtle foreshadowing. After that train passed, I frantically rushed my way up to Wolf after learning that a northbound empty ore had come off the Iron Range sub while I was down waiting for the Bessemer. However, it stopped at Wolf, so I was thankfully able to catch up with it easily and catch the Dash 8 trio throttling up from a stop as they made their way onto the Mintac sub. After this train went by, I was going to go back to Zupets to finish my lunch and wait for a Thundercap SD70M-2 liter that was coming. However, I decided to finish my lunch at Wolf instead. As I was eating my lunch, I noticed rumbling from a distance, and I hopped out of the car and frantically ran up to the tracks just to see the SD70M-2 heading my way. I had no idea it was that close to me, so I was really glad that I didn't go back to Zupets for my lunch. The mid DPU of this train was actually fairly notable, as it was the only teardrop cap GEVO I saw during the whole trip. Next, I would catch a 6-train rush at Zupets. The first train was S773 with an SD70M-2 duo for power. The next train to pass will be an empty T-Bird with 2112 leading. Who could have guessed? Next was a northbound intermodal bound for Vancouver, British Columbia with an ex-Citirail GEVO on the point. The next one was without a doubt the worst train of the trip, C6M duo on a northbound loaded limestone. Next was a southbound loaded T-Bird with the standard Dash 8 duo. The next train was an awesome surprise, that being a Superior, Wisconsin to Winnipeg, Manitoba manifest being led by a duo of SD75Is. I was really hoping to see an SD75 leader when I went up to the Iron Range, and this satisfied my goal. I also got an awesome horn show from the crew, so a big shout out to them for that. With the fleet of trains complete, I would move to the south end of the Fairlane switch to catch the southbound loaded ore with the same power set I saw that morning. I also got a nice horn salute. After U717 finished exiting Fairlane, I rushed my way up to Ramshaw to catch a southbound loaded ore on the Iron Range sub. This is where things got a little crazy, as there would be a T-Bird approaching Iron Junction as soon as this train cleared. After this train cleared, I headed back to Ramshaw to catch a southbound on the Rainy Sub and a northbound on the Iron Range Sub. The southbound on the Rainy Sub showed up first, and I don't know what I was expecting, but this train really exceeded my expectations. With a 0 as possible sticker SD70M-2 leading, a regular SD70M-2 second, a repainted Grand Trunk SD40 third, and a Thundercab SD70M-2 fourth. This was an intermodal, mind you, so I was not ready for this at all. It was a really great train to see, and I'm glad that it blocked the northbound on the Iron Range Sub from crossing first, because I wouldn't have been able to make it in time without this train. My 18th and final train for day 2 of Iron Range rail fanning was the northbound empty ore at Ramshaw on the Iron Range Sub with a Dash 8 trio for power. The next morning when I woke up, I checked Train 15 and saw that a U717 was leaving Fairlane with a tunnel motor do-over power. In a Canada Cab SD40, but who cares about that? There was no chance I was missing this, so I sped out of the Airbnb and headed to Kelsey, where I had stopped to meet a northbound intermodal. I was able to make it just as the train was leaving, and so a chase ensued. My next 3 trains were all solid Dash 8 sets. This manifest with an SD75 leader then broke down at Iron Junction, which held up train traffic for a while, so I headed back to my Airbnb to rest. I headed back trackside when a bunch of mainline trains were coming, so then some action happened. The first train I caught after heading back trackside was this manifest with a Citirail GEVO trailing. Next was this empty ore with a Citirail GEVO on the rear, followed by the manifest again. Next, the manifest that had broken down at Iron Junction earlier was supposed to race a Citirail on a limestone train, but instead, they decided to back the manifest into the Keenan Yard, which meant I got this weird meet between the two instead. After all those city rails, I headed to Ramshaw for 2 trains, a northbound on the Iron Range sub with a Dash 8 trio, and a southbound on the Rainy sub with a GEVO duo, but I got a shave and a haircut from them, so that was pretty cool. After these two, I headed to Forbes to catch 2 mystery northbounds that had both come out of Proctor. The first was the daily Proctor to Winnipeg manifest, also Deer, with an awesome surprise trailing third. BCOL 4653, the Dash 9 that I had pretty much fumbled in Virginia a few nights earlier, was trailing on its way back north. This was an awesome train to see, and although I had missed the unit going south a few days earlier on the local, it was great to see it again in this awesome light, even though it was cloudy. The other northbound was a U-716 out of Proctor being led by 2 Canada Cab SD40s and an Illinois Central Death Star. In fact, this was just a reversed version of the Lashup I saw a few days earlier. I also made a run by Keenan Yard to see the manifest. However, something felt off. As I was on my way back to the Airbnb, I reflected on my few days on the Iron Range and realized that I hadn't seen a Bessemer leader. This made me feel a little empty inside because one of the main reasons I had made this trip was to see a Bessemer leader. So, I headed back to the Airbnb feeling a little defeated since I hadn't achieved one of my main goals. It was then that I got on the Munger rail cam and decided to look through and see if anything cool had gone by. And that's when I found a U-712 had gone by with none other than a Bessemer leader. This led to a mad race to get trackside for this train. I rushed my way south headed towards Kelsey to try to run into the train and was able to find it around dusk. This led to an awesome sunset chase of the train and even a cameo by 2112. The next morning on my way to Duluth, I saw two northbound CN trains. The first was a regular intermodal. The other train was a U-716 at Alborn with the reversed consist from the previous morning, including the two tunnel motors trailing behind the Canada Cab SD40. I saw a lot of cool things at the Canadian National Proctor engine shops and just in the yard in general, but the only real thing of importance to this video is the CN Rainier to Proctor local, as it was the only thing I saw moving. After leaving the CN, I would head to the North Shore Scenic Railroad where I would catch GN 400 leaving their station. We would be seeing this locomotive many more times throughout the day. My next catch of the train would be along the lakefront at Leif Erikson Park. Note that this day was Independence Day, so the lead locomotive was sporting American flags on the nose. My next catch of the train would be at running Longwood Forward while I was eating lunch at a restaurant that overlooks the track. The restaurant played an appropriate song when the train went by. My final catch of the train would be later in the day back at the park. I had heard an M5 of NSSR's Bud RDC, and thinking it was the DMIR SDM, I rushed to the park hoping to catch it. Turns out that I had heard the Bud RDC, as I just said, and not the DMIR SDM, and so I just got another shot of 400. As I was leaving Duluth, I saw these switchers. The next day, I would head off the beaten path again and into Kansas City, where I saw a bunch of trains. First was this drive-by of Kanoki. My next few catches were all BNSF trains I saw while eating at Jack Stack at the Freight House. finishing my lunch, I headed up onto the freight house bridge to catch a train or two. When I got up there, the meet that I had seen happening at Jack Stack was still happening with the third train entering the scene. The eastbound would actually end up being one of the incredibly rare Union Pacific Beelman rock trains. These only run a couple times a year with absolutely no predictability, so this was an awesome catch. It was also my first time actually getting a decent shot of one of these. After the rock train cleared, I noticed that another eastbound was lined, so I decided to stick around. The eastbound would actually end up being the UP MFXAS, a manifest from Fairfax Yard in, well, Fairfax, to the East St. Louis, Illinois, Alton Southern Gateway Yard. As I got closer, I noticed that the lead unit was a bit more faded yellow than usual. Then I noticed it had low number boards, but high ditch lights. Then I noticed that the top of the cab was blue, but faded blue. This could only mean one thing. It was a CSX YN2 AC-44. It had been so long since I'd seen one of these leading a train, so this was an awesome treat, and it was absolutely amazing that I had no idea it was coming. Well, that's going to be pretty much the end of this one. Thanks so much for watching, and thank you all so much for 8,000 subscribers. See ya later.